Is it okay to criticize another group of people for something that you're going to do the very next day? As much as I love the movie Dances with Wolves and enjoy the novels, there is something not quite right in our modern view of the Great Plains of the American frontier. Let's call it oversympathizing in one direction and over-criticizing in another. Here's an example you'll probably remember. As the Native Americans followed the trail of a huge herd of American bison, also called buffalo, they came to a sight that stopped them in their tracks. Let's look at what happened and talk about the story's over-the-top demonizing of the white hunters. The Native Americans were from the Comanche tribe in the novel and the Lakota Sioux in the film. The story and its characters are fictional, but are based on the real history of the American frontier. Let's read quotes from the 1988 novel, and I'll add comments as we go. Enemies had been discovered in the neighborhood, mysterious enemies from another world. By their deeds, they had proven themselves to be people without value and without soul. Wanton slaughterers with no regard for Comanche rights. From the moment he saw the little rose-colored bumps rising in the distance, he knew he was coming to something ugly. Kicking Bird had brought him to the front with a purpose, but his intention was not to punish, it was to educate. A bilious mixture of revulsion and lament climbed steadily in Lieutenant Dunbar's throat. He counted 27 buffalo, and though he couldn't count them, he figured there were at least as many ravens swarming over each body. Wolves were appearing from all directions. They would be crouching at the shoulders and haunches and bellies as soon as the column passed. But there would be more than enough for every wolf and bird within miles. The lieutenant calculated roughly a figure of 15,000 pounds of dead flesh decaying in the hot afternoon sun. 27 hides had been stripped away from neck to buttocks. On one of them he saw that its open mouth held no tongue. Others had been robbed of their tongues too. These buffalo were lying dead on the ground, their guts spread all over the prairie, just because someone wanted their tongues and hides. It struck Dunbar as some kind of crime. Murder. Is that an exaggeration? Let's look at the definition of the word murder. According to dictionary.com, murder is the killing of another human being under conditions specifically covered in law. The U.S. Department of Justice states, Title 19 defines murder as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice. Does that sound applicable to hunting animals where there was no functioning government? Hungry as they were after weeks of scraps, no one had stopped to help himself or herself to the bounty spread out around them. The voices that had been so raucous all morning were now stilled. And he could see in their faces the melancholy that comes from knowing a good trail had suddenly turned bad. Well, I wouldn't say the trail was bad, since they caught up with the herd the next day and had a very successful hunt. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Dunbar took one more shot at white people on his way past the killing ground. My heart sank as I knew it could only be white hunters. Making them the bad guys, without value and without soul, would have made more sense if the film showed the unrestricted buffalo hunts that happened years later, when sport shooting and food warfare almost drove the bison to extinction, before they were saved by the United States government, which will be the subject of another video. In the book and a deleted scene from the film, the natives punished the fur traders as follows. The lieutenant and his horse Cisco had been riding in darkness for half an hour when the fires of the Comanche camp appeared, like faraway dots. The men were yipping, high and shrill, like coyotes, and Dunbar, caught up as he was in the excitement, let out a few barks of his own. He and Cisco edged still closer, and the lieutenant saw they weren't passing sticks around. They were passing lances, and Dunbar caught a glimpse of the hair tied near the lance's point. He realized it was a scalp, a fresh scalp. The hair was black and curly. His eyes darted to the other lances. Two more of them held scalps. One was light brown and the other was sandy, almost blonde. He looked quickly at the captured wagon and saw what he had not seen before. A load of stacked buffalo hides was peeking over the rails. The skins belonged to the murdered buffalo, and the scalps belonged to the men who had killed them, men who had been alive that very afternoon, white men. Notice the difference in language, where the buffalo were murdered, but the hunters had been alive. The film increases the brutality by showing a human hand hanging from the tree branches. And the lieutenant's friend Kickingbird pauses his celebration to watch his reaction. The lieutenant was numb with confusion. He spread his bedroll on the ground and lay looking at the stars, trying to believe that the men who had been killed were bad people and deserved to die. Well, those were the people you were actually sent to the American frontier to protect. This confusion represents his conflict of interest and his shifting loyalties. It was not for him to say. More than anything, he wanted to believe that he was not in this position. And again we have the mental gymnastics to justify abandoning his responsibilities and turning against the United States. At least the lieutenant was smart enough to realize he might be killed next, when the warriors woke him up the next morning. A sparkling new rifle from the fur traders he killed was hanging from one of his hands. Dunbar pictured his own hair dangling from the fierce one's lance. What follows is the epic scene of the buffalo hunt, which begins with much anticipation as the hunters ride within striking distance of the herd. Even Lieutenant Dunbar could feel the tension bristling around him. Death was settling over the prairie with the surety of a descending cloud. After the exciting chase and dozens of animals were killed with arrows and bullets, Dunbar stood over his own kill to sort out his emotions. He felt no pride in having taken the bull's life, but it brought him no remorse either. Nearby hunters were laughing about their kills, waiting as the women and children and elderly poured onto the plains, hauling their butcher equipment along with them. Their voices were ringing with excitement. One of the main arguments in supporting the actions of the Native Americans is how they used all parts of the animal, leaving very little to decay or be eaten by scavengers. This is described in Chapter 19. The butchering was a colossal enterprise. There were perhaps 70 dead buffalo, and at each body, families set up portable factories, transforming animals into usable products. They took everything: hides, meat, guts, hooves, tails, heads. In the space of a few hours, it was all gone, leaving the prairie with the appearance of a gigantic, recently cleared banquet table. This makes sense for a small population of subsistence hunters who survived by harvesting everything they could from these animals. Does that mean no hunting is justified unless you use all parts of the animal? In Dances with Wolves, the white hunters took what they needed to support their livelihoods and left the rest for the wolves and ravens. Maybe they should have taken the meat, but considering how the Native Americans rode them down and killed them, I don't blame them for trying to get out of the area as soon as possible. Aside from that, the natives were not always as efficient as this common belief would tell you. We can read about the observations of 19th century Western painter George Catlin. As described in the 2007 book, Last Stand, The Battle to Save the Buffalo and the Birth of the New West. Catlin's journal, consistent with other contemporaneous documents, hints at one impact on the buffalo herd that fits uncomfortably with our modern popular images. While the image of Indians using every bit of the buffalo they killed appears far more common than wanton slaughter, wasteful killing by Indians did take place.
Gatlin's journal, for example, recounts an 1832 incident in which 500 Sioux killed 1,400 buffalo solely for their tongues, to be traded for whiskey with the American Fur Company.
The book and another deleted scene from the film take one more shot at demonizing the white hunters. When Kickingbird invites Lieutenant Dunbar to take a ride to a grove of trees he used to visit as a boy. The hand of man could make nothing to rival the scope and beauty of this open-air cathedral. The hand of man, however, could destroy it. The proof was already here. The place had been horribly desecrated. Trees of all sizes lay where they had been felled. Most of them had been shorn of their branches, and he could not imagine for what purpose they had been cut. Maybe for firewood? Everywhere he looked, the ground held bodies, or pieces of bodies. There were small animals, badgers and skunks and squirrels, shot for no apparent reason other than target practice. The primary objects of the genocide were deer that sprawled all around him. A few of the bodies were whole, minus only the prime cuts. Most were mutilated. Well, now we've gone from murder to genocide, so let's check the definition. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic extermination of a national, racial, political, or cultural group. Does that definition apply to animals? Let's pass on the next set of quotes, as they describe a scene of heads and limbs arranged in grotesque patterns like out of a horror movie. It was supposed to be humorous. Behind the buildings they found a wide pit, filled to overflowing with the putrid torsos of slaughtered deer, skinless, legless, and headless. For the first hour of their return trip, Dances with Wolves watched the ground, shamed for the white race to which he belonged. And again, we have the shaming language that justifies the lieutenant turning against the United States. What do you think? Did the Native Americans have a right to hunt that the white hunters did not? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel for new videos every week or two, and see the description below for a list of books, films, and online resources featured in this video.